Good afternoon, and welcome to Reconnecting Brooklyn's History, Brooklyn Core, and the Fight for Justice. On behalf of the Brooklyn Public Library and the Center for Brooklyn History, thank you for joining us. My name is Shirley Brown-Alleen, and I'm the Manager of Education for the Center for Brooklyn's History. Our agenda today, currently, of course, we're starting now, and I'm giving you the welcome and overview. And then we have the pleasure of having Dr. Brian Pernell give a talk about Brooklyn Core and the fight for justice in Brooklyn. Afterwards, we will have Q&A, and then we'll do wrap-up surveys and CTLE. If you're looking for a CTLE credit as an educator, please complete today's survey, which we will provide a link and QR code at the end of this workshop. However, we do encourage everyone to please fill out the survey link as we are looking for feedback about today's events. Virtual housekeeping. Please, for today's session, we are utilizing the Q&H feature located at the bottom of your screen. If you have a question, please put it in the Q&A, and at the end of the talk, we will begin asking questions, and Dr. Purnell will answer. Accessibility. If you are looking for closed caption, please look down at the bottom of your screen and press the closed caption, and you'll be able to have that available. If you're having any issues or challenges with that, please email us at cbheducation@brooklynlibrary.org, or just put a note in the chat and one of us will get to you to assist you with that. Please keep in mind that this session is being recorded. However, it will be available later on this week on our website at the Center for Brooklyn's History under Education Resources. Along with this recording, the booklets that you see in the chat, the links to both the booklets for both educators and students will also be available for you to utilize. Our code of conduct. Our events are intended to create a space that nurtures a community of educators that is inclusive of all, regardless of race, ethnicity, gender identity, religion, age, sexual orientation, ability, or stage of professional development. Please come visit us at the Center for Brooklyn's History on our website, as well as when we do open later on this year. And please feel free to come back for our next two Reconnecting Brooklyn's History. On April 7th, we have Andrew Gustafson from Turnstile Tours as we look at Brooklyn's home front during World War II. And then the author of Don't Know Much About History, Kenneth C. Davis, will be discussing immigration on May 4th. Thank you so much for participating. And again, on behalf of the Center for Brooklyn's History, thank you so much for being here. And now I give you Dr. Brian Pernell.
Hello, everyone. I'm very happy to be here. Thank you, Center for Brooklyn History, Brooklyn Public Library, the education staff, the director, the archival team. I'm very, very happy to participate in this event. And also thank you to all of the participants, the teachers, the educators, the librarians, and the students who may be with us today. I am currently in the Center for Brooklyn History, and I'm in a bit of a nondescript office, so I chose a virtual background. I'm pretty sure if most of the participants are from Brooklyn, then you will recognize the background. That's the neighborhood that I grew up in, Coney Island, that's the boardwalk. And so I hope to spend a little bit of time there this summer when things open up and warm up. but we are going to go back in time a bit to the history of the civil rights movement in Brooklyn. And let me just get my screen ready to share, or I am sharing it. Is that right? Could I ask Shirley or Charlie, can you just let me know if my screen is behaving?
We're seeing it.
Great, and it's in the slideshow format?
Yep.
Great. Well, like Shirley said, my presentation today is entitled Brooklyn Core and the Fight for Justice in Brooklyn. Most of this will take place during the early 1960s, although I am going to do a little bit of context that stretches back into the 1930s. My name is Brian Pernell. I am a professor at Bowdoin College, which is in Brunswick, Maine. I grew up in Brooklyn. I lived most of my life in New York City. I've been living in Maine for about 11 years now. All of my education was in New York. I used to teach at Fordham University in the Bronx. There's my email address and my Twitter. I don't know what you call it on Twitter, my Twitter name. If you wanted to email me, I'm happy to hear from you, and you can follow me on Twitter. I usually post about things that have to do with Brooklyn and sources that have to do with Brooklyn. So if you're interested in that, please follow me on Twitter. As a historian, I've spent most of the last 20 years doing research on the history of the civil rights movement in Brooklyn. But I've also done a lot of research on the history of racial discrimination outside of the South. So here's just a couple of highlights from my work as a scholar. You can see the cover of the book that I wrote on the history of the Brooklyn chapter of CORE during the early 1960s. There's also a cover of a collection of essays that I co-edited with a good friend and scholar, Jean Theo Harris. She teaches at Brooklyn College, and she's written a bunch of really good books you might want to check out. One of them is this fantastic book about Rosa Parks, which is actually in a young adult version, a YA version of Jean's book on Rosa Parks. But Jean and I edited a collection of essays on the history of segregation and resistance outside of the South. So that's called The Strange Careers of the Jim Crow North. And most recently, within the past year, I worked with the Center for Brooklyn History on this fantastic public history project called Brooklyn Resists. The link for it is at the end of my slides. And so those are just three things examples of things that I've done that you might find interesting that relate to what I'm speaking about today. Currently, I'm finishing a book which is a narrative history. I wouldn't call it a biography, but it's a narrative history of an educator from Brooklyn whose name was G2 Weiusi. G2 Weiusi was a lifelong Brooklynite. He was an educator. He taught in Brooklyn. I'll speak about him a bit at the end of this presentation, but this is the current book that I'm finishing. It's based on oral history interviews that I did with Mr. Weiusi. And I've also included essays on the history of African-American education in the United States, but also specifically in Brooklyn in this book that I'm finishing. So it's called The Narrative of G2 Weiusi. And his name was, up until about 1969, his name was Les Campbell. And I'm calling him Brooklyn's Black Power educator. So I'm dedicating this book to teachers in Brooklyn, people who work with Black children in Brooklyn. And this is really a book that's meant to inspire, I hope, teachers who want to give a substantive, useful education to children of color in different kinds of schools. So that's this next book. Hopefully it'll come out within the next year and a half. So today, my slides are misbehaving. Okay, there we go. Today's presentation has three parts. The first part is the context part, and it's about what racial discrimination looked like in Brooklyn. And specifically, I'm going to speak about the history of race and residence, the history of race and housing in Brooklyn from about 1930 and till about 1990. So this is really just an overview of the context that shaped the civil rights and Black power movements in Brooklyn, and in some ways has shaped the history of the city and of Brooklyn up until today. But this first part, the context, is very important for what racial discrimination looked like in Brooklyn in the 1960s. The second part of the presentation is to answer the question, well, what was the Brooklyn chapter of the Congress of Racial Equality? And then the conclusion part has to do with, well, what happens after the mid-1960s? Much of my first book, Fighting Jim Crow in the County of Kings, is about the early 1960s, but I always like to end with a little bit of a discussion about what happens after the mid-1960s. And that conversation will really end with the 60s, but I hope our conversation can bring this history into the present. So let's start with the first part about what did racial discrimination look like in Brooklyn? What was the context for this history of resistance and struggle and activism that I'll speak about? The history of race and residence in Brooklyn, like many cities throughout the country, almost every metropolis throughout the country, the history of race and residence takes shape during the years of the Great Depression and the policy history known as the New Deal. And I won't get into a lot of detail on that, but I'm tempted. I know that I can't ask you direct questions, but I would love it if you could look at this map and perhaps just jot down in a note, if you're taking notes, or maybe you can use the chat. I usually like to teach in an interactive way. I like, Zoom is great for the pandemic, but one day we're all gonna be together. We're gonna be at the Center for Brooklyn History. We're gonna do this live. And I'm just wondering, does anybody know what this map is? Or has anyone ever seen this map before? Can I do that, Shirley? Can I ask for people to maybe write in the chat?
Yes, you can. I just put in there,
All right.
they can please feel free to do so.
I have not, okay, well, thank you, Carolina. I appreciate that. It is a map of Brooklyn. Yeah, it is a, I love that. Reclining. It's not a, yeah, but you had it right, Milagros, you had it right. It's redline. It is a redlining map. Is that the neighborhoods that were redlined? Yes. Yeah. Spell check will get you every time, right? Yeah, so that was good. Yeah, so some people have never seen it. That's good to know. First time seeing it, that's really good to know. And it seems like there's a couple of people who have seen it. So I want to use this map to start, and I'm going to try to, control my enthusiasm for talking about this history. But this is what is known as a homeowners loan corporation assessment map. It is a survey map that the Homeowners Loan Corporation created in the 1930s. Now, the Homeowners Loan Corporation was one of the many New Deal policies and programs that emerges to address the catastrophic economic conditions of the Great Depression. One of the key problems, and there were a lot of them, that occurred during the Great Depression, and the Great Depression is roughly 1929, October 1929, through about 1942, maybe 1943, 1944. So the Great Depression was a calamitous decade and more of economic insecurity, economic instability, poverty, joblessness, dislocation of residencies, bankruptcies, business failures. It was really a terrible, terrible time economically in the United States and in many parts of the world. One of the issues that the country faced during the Great Depression was foreclosures on homes and businesses. People could not pay their mortgages. They could not pay their insurance rates and their rents on their businesses. And there was really a quite catastrophic cascade effect of businesses not being able to pay their insurance premiums, and then the not being able to pay their rents on their buildings. Then the landlords who owned the buildings weren't able to pay their mortgages, and then the banks weren't able to pay interest on the loans that they put out there. So banks failed. Same thing happened in the housing market when people couldn't pay their rents in their apartments. The owners of the buildings couldn't pay their mortgages. Then the banks couldn't pay out interest on loans that they put out. And there's a cascade effect of the collapsing of the economy. And a lot of it is centering around housing and around rents and around property. So one of the many policies that the federal government initiates during the New Deal is policies to stop the decline of the housing market. And the federal government gets into the business for the first time of guaranteeing and securing mortgages. So the federal government does two things. One, it works with banks to secure the mortgages that the banks themselves will lend out to private people. What that means is the federal government says, we will guarantee the mortgages that you give out to private citizens and to businesses. We will guarantee that if the borrowers fail at a high rate, then we will make up the shortfall. That is one thing that the federal government does during the Great Depression. The other thing that the federal government does is it actually gets into the business of housing. It funds housing developments, public housing developments. It underwrites it, which means that it guarantees the financing for public housing developments, and it also creates the Federal Housing Administration, which is going to eventually become the Housing and Urban Development Administration within the federal government, which still exists today, as does the FHA, the Federal Housing Administration. But the Homeowners Loan Corporation does not exist. It was an initial measure to try and get the government out into the business of securing mortgages so there wasn't a complete collapse of the economy and that the economy could get put on stronger foundations and footing. So now that the government is working with banks and with lenders to put money into the housing market, the government has to make sure that the lenders are going to invest the money in areas that are not, that have low risk of foreclosure or turnover or plummeting in the prices of the properties. So they send assessors out into metropolises to conduct surveys of areas and to find out which areas were considered safe investments and which areas were considered risky or hazardous. And that's what these maps are. These maps are the products of those community-based surveys. These are the assessment risk maps that the institutions, the banks and the money lenders and the realtors and the developers, they use these maps to know which areas in a city were considered safe for investment and development and which were considered hazardous or risky. So they color-coded the different communities on the maps as a way of indicating with a quick glance which parts of a city should receive loans and investment and which ones should not. Now the green areas, in these maps, green means go, green means good. The green areas were considered the safest, the best, the most reliable for investment and development. The blue areas were considered safe and secure and sturdy. The yellow areas were what was called cautionary areas, was the language that they used. And then the red areas were considered, at the standards of the surveyors, the red areas were considered hazardous. That's the term, the language that they used. So in short, a redlined area in the Depression, and these maps became useful long after the Depression ended. These were kind of the standards for where lenders would channel money through the 1940s and 50s. The repercussions of these assessments last into the late 1960s and perhaps beyond, as we will see. What these maps do is they determine where money will flow into and where money and investment capital will flow away from. So red areas are the areas where the money, the capital, the investment is going to flow away from those red areas for the foreseeable future because those areas are considered quote unquote hazardous. And the money is going to flow into the blue areas, the green areas, and even some of the yellow areas. So what could get an area a hazardous grade or assessment? There were a lot of reasons that an area could be quote unquote redlined. An area could be redlined if it was near a factory. An area could be redlined for industrial sites. An area could be redlined for waste management, waste transfer stations, sewage plants, water treatment plants. Those areas could be redlined. An area could be redlined when you get into the demographics, the statistics about the people. Areas were redlined for having large numbers of poor people. Areas could be redlined for having large numbers of immigrants. Areas could be redlined for having poor access to commercial and employment districts. Areas could be redlined for having inadequate transportation. Areas could be yellow lined for being on the border of these hazardous areas, but the areas could be yellow lined too for being sparsely populated, right? So now the most consistent reason that an area, a community, could be redlined was for having even the smallest number of Black people living in it. Researchers have uncovered that an area could consistently be redlined, that is, considered hazardous, for having as little as 5% of its population being African American. And it did not matter if these African Americans were poor, it didn't matter if they were middle class, it didn't matter if they had high educations, the presence, or in the language of the assessments themselves, the quote unquote infiltration of Black people, even a small number, was enough to get the area, quote, redlined. Now, like I said in the middle of this explanation, redlining maps do not necessarily correspond to where Black people are at the time. This is Brooklyn, this map. This map is from 1938. All those areas that are redlined are not where Black people live in Brooklyn in 1938. This map shows not necessarily the racial characteristics of the area. This map shows where the money is going to flow away from and where the money is going to flow into. The standard of deeming an area hazardous or redlining it with even a small number of Black people plays a very important role for where Black people are going to live during the decades after these maps provide the context for distributing mortgages and loans during the Great Depression. Now, one last thing on this, and then I'll show you some maps of where Black people live, and then we'll get into the history of discrimination and resistance. This isn't just an indication. This map isn't just an indication of which areas the people that made the maps thought were, dangerous for investments. These maps are going to show where will the new government-backed mortgages go? Where will the new government-backed business loans go? Where will developers look to build new housing? A redlined area could have been redlined for the status of its housing. If the housing was old, overcrowded, decrepit, declining, then an area could be redlined. So redlined areas actually will not receive housing development investment over the course of the New Deal and the years beyond it. So what we're looking at when we look at a red line map is we're looking at a barometer, a kind of temperature gauge for the areas in a city that are going to experience investment and development. Red line areas in the foreseeable future will experience underdevelopment. And the money is going to flow into those green and blue areas and even some of the yellow ones. And it's also going to flow into the suburbs. But let's move on and see what the effect of this is on Black people in particular in Brooklyn and on Brooklyn in general. So African Americans are going to begin moving to places like Brooklyn and New York City and cities all around the country. They're going to begin moving there in incredibly large numbers, starting in the 1920s and teens and lasting into the 1960s and 70s, but really taking off in the 1940s and 50s. So you can see that the context for the types of discriminatory treatment that African Americans are going to experience in part comes from this structural history of financing for housing and commercial development in cities. When African Americans start to move into cities by the hundreds and hundreds of thousands in the 40s and 50s and 60s, they're going to be funneled into the areas where they can find housing. And those areas are going to be largely where small pockets of African Americans lived in the 20s and 30s, and they're going to be in the areas that are redlined and that become kind of the epicenters of Black communal life, because in large part, African Americans could not live outside of those areas because of discrimination in the housing market. Owners and renters and landlords would not sell or rent to Black people, but Black people also can't live outside of these epicenter areas because they can't attain the mortgages and the finance to move into areas where they could possibly buy homes. And also the early history of suburbs is a completely racially segregated history. It's not until the 70s that we start to see the suburbs open up in pretty significant ways to middle-class Black people who have the money to move into suburbs. But during the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, when hundreds of thousands of African Americans are moving into Brooklyn, they're gonna move into a fairly circumscribed area. And let's see what that looks like in terms of the numbers and the concentrations. This next map, again, it's gonna show Brooklyn. This is a population concentration map based on census data. You can see in the upper corner, this is for the 1940 census in Brooklyn. You could kind of, I hope you could see Brooklyn okay and make it out. The brown areas, or the kind of like maroon areas, those are areas on this map which are, you know, 0.5%, less than 5%, less than 5% Black are those areas that are kind of maroon. So those areas are all like 95, 99% white. And you can see in the center part of Brooklyn, central Brooklyn, if you know Brooklyn, we're talking about just northeast of Prospect Park. It's the Bedford-Stuyvesant, Crown Heights area. You can begin to see, you see some green areas up there, some kind of lime green and a little bit forest green and a little yellow. Those darker green areas in 1940, that means that those communities, those census tracts, and that we're talking about kind of the center of Bedford-Stuyvesant, Bedford and Nostrand, Fulton and Nostrand rather, right, kind of right in the center there. Those lime green areas are about 30% Black. Those census tracts, those communities are about 30% African American. And that's the largest concentration really in Brooklyn, are those couple of areas in central Brooklyn, which are about 30% Black. Now watch what happens as I go through 1950, 1960, 1970. And as an indication, anywhere you see dark, dark blue, those areas are 95%, in this case, Black. So pay attention to the dark blue. I'm gonna go through it slowly, and then I'm gonna go through it kind of cartoon style a little bit quicker. So this is 1940, and each click is gonna be a decade. So let me give you some of the numbers. Now we're looking at 1990. Let me just tell you some of the population statistics during these decades. 1940, we see that Brooklyn is, there's 2.7 million people in Brooklyn in 1940. 1950, you see that's the high point, that is a high point. A high point of Brooklyn's population is 1950, 2.7 million people. And during those decades, the borough is overwhelmingly white, 96%, over 90% white. But as we see, as we go from the 40s into the 80s, the population of African Americans is going to increase fivefold. There will be over 700,000 Black people in Brooklyn by 1980. Today, in the 2010 census, there are well over 860,000 Black people in Brooklyn. But by 1980, there's 700,000 Black people. And we notice that the white population has gone down astronomically. Brooklyn loses 1.3 million white people from 1940 to 1980. Now, the percentages, though, are as significant as the raw numbers themselves. I have to just, Brooklyn goes from, in 1940, wait, my screen sharing is paused. Can you all see my screen, or did I do something messed up?
We still see it.
Okay, sorry, apologies to the Zoomiverse. The percentages, I think, are as important as the raw numbers. There's only 4% of Brooklyn is Black in 1940. Pretty small amount. I won't say insignificant, but that's small. By the time you get to 1980, a third of the borough identifies as Black, right? Like that is a significant jump. Brooklyn is still about 50% white in 1980, but it goes from being less than 5% Black to being almost 33% Black, almost being a third Black. That is a really significant increase in the population during those 40 to 50 years. Now, the increase in the population, as these census demographic maps show, it is not spread throughout the borough. African Americans are living in very specific, concentrated, circumscribed areas that usually center around Bedford-Stuyvesant. When we get to 1970 and 80, we do see African Americans spreading out more, or we see Black people. I won't say African Americans because there's a lot of Caribbean people. There's native-born Black people. There's Black immigrants from the Caribbean. They're going to spread out in Brooklyn into East Flatbush, into Flatbush, down into Canarsie. But the epicenter is going to exist within the Bedford-Stuyvesant, central Brooklyn area. And that's where all of those hundreds of thousands of Black people initially are going to start to move and concentrate. They're not going to spread throughout the borough into all the neighborhoods because of housing discrimination and because of discrimination within the development and mortgage markets, which are going to confine Black people to very specific areas within Bedford-Stuyvesant and central Brooklyn. So look at those, look at the cool, dark blue sea that's going to center around those lime green areas. Those lime green areas are going to go from 30% Black to 99% Black, and it's going to spread out from there to really create a Black enclave, a Black city almost, because by the time you get to 1960, you're talking about 350,000 people just within the central Brooklyn, Bedford-Stuyvesant area. So watch again in fast motion, the concentration of Black people within the borough from 1940 to 1990. Right, and that's when we get to 1990. And again, in 1990, you could see Black people moving down. But if we're talking about 1960, this is really one of the high points of the concentration, the circumscribed, limited geographic areas where Black people are living in Brooklyn. It reaches a peak in 1960, 1970 within that central Brooklyn area. And by 1960, those dark blue areas, like I said, we're talking about 350, 400,000 people just living in those sections of Brooklyn. And that's the conclusion of this first part. What is the effect? What is the social effect of that kind of geographically limited housing opportunities and high concentrations of people in, areas that were, if you remember, redlined, which meant that these were overcrowded to begin with. They already had some housing that needed improvement. And again, the redlining maps, those are places where money is going to flow away from the areas that are red and towards the areas that are blue. So we're talking about concentrations of Black people in areas that are starving for development and housing improvement, and Black people themselves, because of discrimination, are always hungry for affordable housing in American cities. So that's some of the context. And so what are the social effects of this history of both housing discrimination and underdevelopment? Well, some of the effects are going to be incredibly stressed conditions on the quality of the housing. This is 701 Gates Avenue in Brooklyn.
Hey, Brian, we're still seeing the population of Brooklyn by race slide.
Uh-oh,
Up on the
okay.
screen.
Still?
Yeah.
What about now?
Still seeing it. I think that, there we go. Now, okay.
All right, all right. Sorry about that. How about now?
We see the
Okay.
building with the people in the window.
Thank you for your patience. I appreciate that. So this is 701 Gates Avenue, kind of, right in the middle of Bedford-Stuyvesant. The effects of this history of underdevelopment and housing discrimination within the wider city, Black people couldn't live in other places because people wouldn't rent to them, wouldn't sell to them because of their race. They're forced to live in these areas where the population is exploding and stress on the housing conditions is increasing. And again, the development money is flowing away from these areas. So the landlords, the owners, it's very difficult for them to get loans and to be able to develop the areas to improve it. So there's going to be a considerable decline in the conditions in housing where Black people are forced to live. And another condition, which is really important, is there's going to be an increase in some of the environmental problems within communities like Central Brooklyn, namely around trash. But trash is just one of several environmental hazards. There's going to be air quality control problems, lead paint problems, rodents, rats, roaches, infestation problems. There's a whole host of medical environmental issues that are going to concentrate in predominantly poor, predominantly Black areas of American cities, in part because of the history of underdevelopment that stems from the decisions that those neighborhood assessment surveyors made during the New Deal, when the history of development changed and became much more possible with the support and the guaranteed backing of the federal government. So what we have are neighborhoods that are overcrowded, underdeveloped, stressed, concentrations of poverty, and African Americans who need good housing can't find it, even if they can afford it. And this is what's going to give rise, in part, to activism and protest in the North during the Civil Rights Movement. So the Brooklyn chapter of CORE is one of the, if not the most active protest organization in Brooklyn, in New York City during the 1960s. And I just very quickly want to give you some characteristics of, well, what was Brooklyn CORE? There are three main characteristics of the Congress of Racial Equality that shaped the Brooklyn chapter during the early 1960s. First is the Congress of Racial Equality adheres to, believes in, practices nonviolence. So here's an image of a woman, Barbara Weeks, who was a member of the Brooklyn chapter of CORE. Brooklyn CORE protested against employment discrimination at a business in Brooklyn. It was called the Ebinger's Baking Company. And they tried to increase the number of jobs for Black people at Ebinger's. They couldn't, they were stalled in their negotiations. So Brooklyn CORE used nonviolent disruptive tactics to push the company to hire more Black people. So they went down to the main delivery area for the baking company. Ebinger's had stores all throughout Brooklyn, Queens, Staten Island. It was based in Brooklyn. They would bake their products, their cakes, their donuts, their cookies, and then they would send them out to the retail outlets. So what Brooklyn CORE did was they used nonviolent protest tactics. They laid down in front of the delivery trucks to stop them from making their deliveries. And the police officers had to come and carry them away. And that is an example of CORE's adherence of nonviolence and how it would influence their protests. And again, this is from a protest against employment discrimination in Brooklyn. Brooklyn CORE is also, or CORE in general during these years, is philosophically interracial. CORE comes into existence in the early 1940s. And aside from nonviolence, the other principle of CORE is that CORE wants to create interracial Black-white memberships, because CORE believed that Black and white memberships using nonviolence would become an example for the nation to radically transform its racist practices and culture. Now, this is a really interesting family that was involved in Brooklyn Core. This is the Beebled family. They become very important at the center of Brooklyn Core's protest in the early 1960s against education, discrimination, and racism within the public school system. I'm not going to get into a lot of details on that. We can talk about it if you want during Q&A. But I use this picture because I think it's a good picture that represents the membership of Brooklyn Core. So the mother and the father are Elaine and Jerome Beebled. They were members of Brooklyn Core. And these are their children, Douglas, Carrington, and Melanie. And Brooklyn Core kind of looked like the Beebled family. It was evenly split between Blacks and whites. It was mostly adults in their 30s and 40s, although there were some college students, there were some high school students, and there were some older people. But it's mostly Black, it's mostly white. There's some Puerto Ricans. They do some outreach to the Spanish-speaking community in Brooklyn. But this is representative of Core's philosophy of interracialism. Blacks and whites would work together to create change through nonviolent protest. I should add, and people, if you're interested, we could talk about this, having an interracial community of activists was not always easy. There were mistakes, there was discomfort, there was debate. It took a lot of work to sustain a community of Blacks and whites working together for racial justice. It was not easy to form these alliances and to form this community. It took a lot of work. So that's the second characteristic of Core and of Brooklyn Core during the early 1960s. It is interracial, so nonviolent, interracial. And the last component is direct action. Core followed the Gandhian principles of civil disobedience and direct action protest. There were a whole bunch of steps that Core had to follow before it initiated a direct action campaign. But I emphasize this because it's important to know that Core, by its philosophy, was action-oriented. It wanted to be out in the community, conducting surveys, talking to people, organizing people, and getting people involved. And one of the clearest ways that they did this was to initiate demonstrations that attracted people because of the public nature of the demonstrations, the direct action campaigns. So here's an example of a 1961 protest against housing discrimination in Brooklyn. These were brand new homes being constructed in the Midwood section of Brooklyn. And the construction company, Brooklyn Core found, would not sell these new model homes to African Americans. So Brooklyn Core created picket lines. They gave out information in the area about the discriminatory treatment that the construction company practiced towards Black people. And then they occupied the unfinished, unlived in home and conducted what they called a dwell-in. They slept in it so that the construction workers couldn't finish and the construction company couldn't show it to potential buyers. This is just one of many examples of the type of direct action campaigns that Brooklyn Core initiated in the early 1960s. So, nonviolent, interracial, direct action protests. Those are the three main characteristics of the Congress of Racial Equality and of the Brooklyn chapter. Here's another example of the type of direct action that Brooklyn Core would use. This was at a protest against discrimination in the construction unions. This was at the Downstate Medical Center facility, 1963. The building trades unions had discriminatory treatment against Black workers for many years And Brooklyn Corps picked the construction site of the Downstate Medical Center construction in 1963, and they disrupted the site nonviolently by doing things like laying down in front of the construction trucks, the cement trucks, the dump trucks, and preventing them from doing. They shut down the site by using these types of direct action, nonviolent tactics. And again, too, well, my next example will make this clear. This is a very public, disruptive, nonviolent way of drawing attention to the effects of racial discrimination in Brooklyn. Let me give a more extended example a bit, and it relates to the earlier part of the lecture. What are the effects of those decades of underdevelopment and discriminatory practices? We talked about concentrations of people, the inability to move, high population densities in small numbers of areas, and the concentration of social problems that relate to large numbers of people who don't receive adequate city services like sanitation. I will briefly talk about what Brooklyn Corps called Operation Clean Sweep. So trash was a problem. There's inadequate sanitation collection in Brooklyn. Brooklyn Corps does surveys. They follow trucks. They see which areas are getting large numbers of sanitation pickup. They do comparative analysis with all white areas, particularly Marine Park, which had half or a quarter of the population density of Bedford-Stuyvesant. Brooklyn Corps petitions the city. They try to negotiate with the Department of Sanitation to get more trash pickups in Bedford-Stuyvesant. The city cries poverty. They don't have the money in the budget. They can't increase the number of trash pickups in Bedford-Stuyvesant. What they do, though, is they conduct an education campaign to try to teach people in Bedford-Stuyvesant how to throw their garbage out. That's when Brooklyn Corps has had enough, because the Department of Sanitation is blaming the behavior of the people for the problem of the trash, when Brooklyn Corps pointed out this was not a behavioral issue, this was a structural issue, this was an institutional issue of inadequate services in the area that population-wise required it. So what Brooklyn Corps does is they rent trailers, they follow a Department of Sanitation vehicle throughout the neighborhood. This is, by the way, a picture of a Brooklyn Corps member conducting surveys outside of an area with a lot of bulk trash, household trash, and people are living next to this. People are walking past it. Children are playing in it. It's a really dangerous environmental hazard. Here's another image which you saw earlier. So Brooklyn Corps rents trailers. They follow a trash truck through the neighborhood. They pick up all the trash that the Department of Sanitation garbage truck leaves behind. They're doing it in public. Again, part of the purpose of these nonviolent direct action campaigns was to be in public, to be present and visible, to attract attention and possibly new membership. They collect the garbage, they drive it. You can see the U-Haul, the trailer behind the car with all the trash in it. They bring it to the steps of Borough Hall. If you ever come down to the Center of Brooklyn History, and I hope you do one day, Borough Hall is right here on Remsen Street, right near the courthouses. That's where the seat of Brooklyn's government was. Back when Brooklyn was an independent city before 1898, that's where City Hall was. Brooklyn Corps brings all the garbage down to Borough Hall. They unload it. There's this police officer was caught blindsided, on this early morning with trash pickup. And Brooklyn Corps dumps all the trash in front of Borough Hall. All the trash that the Department of Sanitation did not pick up. They dump it there. They hang signs and protest with signs that say, "Show us integration with better sanitation." Again, if you're familiar with the history of the civil rights movement, you know that this is 1962, by the way. You know that integration in the South means integrating schools, integrating college campuses, integrating restaurants and lunch counters. Well, in Brooklyn, integration meant equal city services, equal trash collection that was comparable or required by their population size and their need. So that's what racial integration looks like outside of the South. It's equity in the services that the city provides for its citizens. This is a question about structural equity, institutional equity, not necessarily integration around a lunch counter. The police are caught a bit, again, blindsided. They don't really know what to do. They don't arrest them for dumping. They issue them a ticket. There's Marjorie Leeds. She's one of the white women who's in Brooklyn Core. She's the one who's going to receive the citation. She's going to receive the ticket. And so the cops write her a ticket, and Brooklyn Core continues with its demonstration. Here's Bernard Hall, a child member of Brooklyn Core. His family was in Brooklyn Core, parading with what I think is one of the best signs from this movement. And it says, "Give us a first-class Bedford-Stuyvesant community." I'm getting the hook. See, I got too into it. Sandman came and gave me the hook. So I'm going to start to wrap it up. And I apologize for going through the rest of it quickly. But give us a first-class Bedford-Stuyvesant community. I'll come back to that at the very end. So this is Brooklyn Core. Brooklyn Core does a whole bunch of campaigns like this throughout the early 1960s. They really kind of hit their peak in 1964, 1965. And the organization is gonna, well, the membership and the direct action, nonviolent interracial groups is gonna start to dissipate and change as the 60s change. And let me just give you an indication of what that looks like. So after the early mid-1960s, the civil rights movement in Brooklyn is gonna move in a much more vigorous direction. There's gonna be a one-day boycott of all the public schools to, again, draw attention to racial segregation in public education. There's going to draw attention to a whole host of issues at the World's Fair, and this was a Brooklyn Core campaign. They organized what they called the Stall-In. They wanted to get all these cars to go out to Flushing Meadows at the World's Fair in Queens and conveniently run out of gas as a means of creating massive traffic jams to draw attention to the inequities of employment, poor housing, schools, and police brutality that were affecting African Americans throughout the city and in Brooklyn in particular. So this is really the last major campaign that Brooklyn Core leads in the 1960s. Here's another flyer, and both of these sources, by the way, are at the Center for Brooklyn History. This was a stunt that Brooklyn Core tried to pull, again, to draw attention to inadequate housing in African-American communities in Brooklyn and Harlem. The plan was to have everybody turn their water faucets on at the same time to make the water pressure drop throughout the city. This was a very audacious and strange kind of media campaign that, if you're interested, we could talk about. But just to conclude, here's another picture from the World's Fair protests. In 1964, Brooklyn becomes one of the first places to have an uprising as a response to police brutality in the city. A police officer shoots a young Black teenager in Manhattan, and African-American communities in Brooklyn and Manhattan are gonna rise up in protests that turn disruptive and violent in terms of Black protesters and police officers squaring off against each other in the streets, bricks, bottles, high numbers of arrests, beatings. It becomes a flashpoint of violence, which spreads in some ways throughout cities throughout the country in the mid to late 1960s. So we kind of begin to see that nonviolent aspect of Core on the wane, on the decline in African-American communities. So Core itself is going to shift too. It's going to move more towards Black nationalist, African-American centered, cultural centered, all Black organizing and leadership. Sonny Carson was the chairperson of Brooklyn Core throughout the late 1960s and into the early 1970s. And he is a iconic figure of Black nationalism within Brooklyn. And, you know, there's going to be movements in different directions. There's going to be a movement for community control of schools. Instead of calling for desegregation and integration of schools throughout Brooklyn, there's going to be a call for Black families and communities and teachers and principals to control the institutions within their communities. This is going to bring the community control movement into a conflict with the teachers union. And that standoff is really going to also blow up into a conflict over Black teachers and Black families and predominantly white teachers and white citizens who are supporting the teachers. It's going to create a citywide strike. The schools are going to shut down. And it's going to be this very contentious and volatile moment in New York City when the entire schools are focused on the community control districts, one of which, the most well-known of which, is in Ocean Hill, Brownsville in Brooklyn. So this is 1968, 1969. Here we go again. There's Leslie Campbell. And I end here because Leslie Campbell is a teacher who's involved in the strikes, and he's going to move out of the public education system. He's going to move into all Black community-centered, educational program-centered, cultural-centered initiatives to try to consolidate and concentrate African-American protests and politics in the city. So we see things like the African Cultural Street Festival, which starts in 1969 and still exists today. We'll also see focus and consolidation around political power, the creation of a congressional seat in Brooklyn, which Shirley Chisholm is the first to win in 1968. And that's kind of where the movement goes. But I should conclude too that the problems around discrimination, racism, housing, jobs, and policing remain into the end of the decade, and in some ways up until today. This is a mural dedicated to Yusef Hawkins, who was killed by racial mob violence in Brooklyn in 1989 when he went to an all-white neighborhood to try to buy a car. So I'll end there, and as a way of saying that the evolution of the civil rights and Black power movement flows through the 60s, but the problems don't end. There are some resources that you could take advantage of at the Center for Brooklyn History. And I think these slides will be available. I gave some other resources which you could use. So I went over my time and I apologize for that.
Thank you, Brian. I am so glad that you were able to be here with us. Couple of things. Does anyone have any questions? I know I saw one, which there was a question about what was the population of Jews in Brooklyn during, here's approximately what percentage of the whites were Jewish during the civil rights movement?
Oh, okay. In Brooklyn Core, what percentage of the whites were Jewish? I would say, I don't know the exact answer to that. Brooklyn Core was always very small. I would say of all the white people in Brooklyn Core, American-born Jews were the majority of the white people, is how I would put it. So Jewish Brooklynites were heavily involved in the civil rights movement. Marjorie Leeds, I mentioned her. Her maiden name was Marjorie Ann Sorge. She married a Black West Indian man named Oliver Leeds. She's a member of Brooklyn Core. So I would say that Jewish Brooklynites are probably the most present cultural ethnic group of white people in Brooklyn who are involved in the civil rights movement, for sure.
Okay. Unfortunately, we have run out of time. I
Oh.
wish we could
I'm so sorry.
do some more. No, it's okay, please.
It's that-
If
it's that
anything,
cut.
if anything, this has just told us that we really need to make this longer. So I'm just glad,
No, I need
I'm
to
just
make it
thankful
shorter.
that you were here. And I want to let everyone know if we did not get to your question in the Q&A, we're going to send it to Brian and we will email you with the answer. But thank you again for joining us. If you are here looking for CTLE credit, or if not, we do ask you to please please click on the link or use the QR code to access our survey, as we would love to know how to best improve. You can also write in there, do it longer, because the speaker was absolutely fabulous. I do not have a problem with that. What I will also do is this particular video, along with the booklets, will be on our website by the end of the week. With Brian's permission, I will put his slide there, or we will email the slides to you. Okay, so thank you so much. Okay, so again,
Thanks, everybody.
so again, on behalf of the Brooklyn Public Library Center for Brooklyn History, and I'd like to say thank you again to Dr. Brian Pernell. This was really a great talk, and for me, being a Brooklynite, these are things I didn't learn in school, which I love hearing you talk and I love learning about them. And I like to also say thank you to everyone. Thank you for participating, and I hope you have a good evening. Oh. And again, yes, this recording will be available on our website under educational resources, under Reconnecting Brooklyn's History. All of the Reconnecting Brooklyn's History sessions are all recorded, and they are all put on the website within 1 to 2 days, at the latest 3 days after each session. I see that Laverne and Robbie both have their hands up. If you could please send me a message in the chat, I will answer to the best of my abilities.